Preface. I do not like the word should. Or at least, I do not like how it has been used in books, videos, and lectures that purport to teach people how to write. The term should is used often enough that authors might be tricked into thinking there is an objective way to write well. That there is some pantheon of writing deities who have brought forth the 10 commandments of writing, and that only the wise and sage-like amongst us can discern their will. Dare you write a book that is pure and unadulterated wish fulfillment? If you write a book that fails to use the 3-act structure, curse ye. Doom awaits those that write vampire romances with one-dimensional characters. While I would not call this a philosophy of writing, at risk of joining the ranks of the pretentious Barthesian literary theorists of history, my personal position is that an author owes no obligation in their work other than to write the story they wish to read. There are writing techniques we can use to make for a more satisfying story, one that might be published, but that isn't always the end goal for an author. Authors can write stories for any number of reasons: mental health, personal fulfillment, to express one's love of another story, as in fanfiction, or writing for another person, like Rick Riordan, who originally wrote Percy Jackson and The Lightning Thief for his son Haley, who has ADHD and dyslexia. This is why I prefer to think of the On Writing series not as instructions on how you should write, but as discussions about why certain stories are satisfying to the average reader, and why others are not. I use the word should a total of 9 to 7 times in this book, only 17 of which contain an imperative. Across a 71,000-word book, that's one instruction every 4,200 words on writing. I choose to use the term lightly. It carries with it a connotation that these other motivations for writing are not valuable, which simply is not true. Writing is as much for me about processing issues I have dealt with in real life as it about my desire to write a story that others find captivating. This is why my characters often deal with issues that I have also dealt with. Going through whatever that might be in detail, delving into the psychology, and seeing how my characters deal with it helps me break the issue down into manageable pieces. In a sense, it helps me feel less alone in that struggle. The genesis of this book is really in the genesis of the On Writing series online. This was back in late 2017, a different time, a different era, the age of the video essay. In particular, video essays about writing had become more prominent. There had always been a few YouTubers who discussed narrative and structure and writing techniques, and the whole of AuthorTube, people like Shailin Writes, had been talking about books for nigh on a decade. Between 2016 and 2018 or so, there was an explosion of YouTubers talking about these same topics, and their videos would get millions of views. It was exciting to someone who sits down with Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and takes excessive notes on why its first chapter works so damn well. Hint, J.K. Rowling introduces every major concept and virtually every major character in the story with well-hidden expository writing. Nerd paradise. But I noticed a trend over time. The vast majority of this content was akin to the 5 tips for the articles you would find scattered about the mores and mires of the internet. 5 tips for writing your first chapter. Firstly, introduce your main character. Secondly, open the book with an exciting hook. These are fine tips to give, but they aren't actually helpful. Okay, a writer has to introduce their main character, but how do we go about doing that in a compelling way? Hooks are useful tools, but how do you construct a good one? Virtually every book, good and bad, has a hook. Which questions should act as your hook given how you build tension throughout the rest of the story? A lot of writers know these basic tips already, often instinctually, even if they do not know the academic terminology. This means that without that extra layer of depth to the discussion, it isn't all that helpful to the average writer. Beyond this, these videos were usually written in the context of a particular television show or film that had recently come out, meaning the discussion was often more about the story than how the techniques work. There is nothing wrong with this type of content, I want to be clear. It is a fantastic new dimension through which we can analyze stories we love, and while the video essay format is limited, it is valuable, and it has a lot of steam left in it. It simply was not what I needed. I wanted to have in-depth discussions about narrative, story structure, character design, and world-building that drew on a multitude of sources to give an adequate breadth to the conversation. These discussions needed to be measured and not confined to a 5-minute video. If you have been following the On Writing series for long, you will know that I have recently gotten a bit carried away with the not confined to a 5-minute video thing. All of this ultimately motivated me to create the On Writing series, and thus this book, the compilation of all my work for it plus a few extras. Not videos on topics too broad to be helpful, but educational and detailed breakdowns of very niche and specific elements of storytelling with clear, coherent, and in-depth discussions about how we might write a satisfying story. To my shock, it worked. And with a video discussing hard magic systems, in all honesty a little known concept in writing circles, that has since garnered 1.4 million views. I am immensely grateful to all who have supported me and this series. When it took off, I had this moment where everything clicked for my life online. This was what I wanted to do. Education has always been a passion of mine, and the On Writing series allowed me to pursue it in perhaps the best environment I could. A special thank you to my patrons on Patreon, whose financial support literally means the difference between me paying rent or not. They also encouraged me to put this book together, helped me pick the artist for the cover, and the art itself. They also helped me pick thumbnails for videos, which is a lot more stressful than you might imagine. One are also Courtney, who for some unknown reason, read the chapters of my terrible fantasy book I had been writing and rewriting for a decade. I have since gone scorched earth on that book, by the way, and though it may seem like all your time was wasted, your continual investment in me kept me going through to doing YouTube. I could never forget Ellie, who has been a vital cog in the workings of my career. You have read almost every script and provided invaluable feedback with your understanding of narrative, so thank you. Another huge thank you to my girlfriend, Laura, and my parents, Anna and Steve, who did the whole loving and encouraging me to pursue my dreams thing. Turns out that is a pretty vital part of the development of a kid. What I hope is that this book, a codified version of the On Writing and World-Building series, will serve as a valuable educational resource that offers clear points that you may not have always considered when putting together your story. Stay nerdy, Tim. Part 1. Prologues. Paper Towns by John Green, A Game of Thrones by G.R. Martin, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, Eragon by Christopher Paolini, Leviathan Wakes by James S. A. Corey, A Dance with Dragons by G.R. Martin, Altered Carbon by Lita Kalogridis, based on Richard K. Morgan's book of the same name, Harry Potter, and Half-Blood Prince by J.A. Rowling, Harry Potter, and the Philosopher's Stone by J.A. Rowling, Avatar, The Last Airbender by Michael D. Martino and Brian Konietzko. How you start your novel is one of the most important decisions you will ever make as a writer, and part of this is considering whether you should use a prologue. As always, the best way to begin your novel will vary depending on your style, genre, and legitimate personal creative choices, but there are some ways of doing prologues that work better than others in terms of engaging the reader. A prologue is a segment that takes place before the first chapter, and the defining feature of a prologue is its distance from the main narrative. This might be in 1. The point of view. It is told from the perspective of a different character to the main story, like in The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. 2. Time. It takes place significantly after or before the main narrative, like the first part in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which takes place 10 years prior. I use the term a part here because the opening segment is called a Chapter 1, but it truly operates more as a prologue. 3. Geography. It takes place in a vastly different setting to the majority of the narrative, like in the 2018 Netflix series Altered Carbon. In this section on prologues, we will be discussing hooks, necessity, backstory, exposition, the importance of tone, mood, and theme in a prologue, and length. Hooks. Having a prologue as well as a first chapter usually means you have 2 hooks at the beginning of your book. This allows for you as the author to introduce 2 big questions to the reader. The challenge with this double hook structure is that the prologue hook can undermine the tension arising from the hook in the first chapter. This is because some authors use the prologue to explain a mysterious element of the story. Imagine, for example, if Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince used a prologue hook explicitly depicting Snape making the unbreakable vow to kill Dumbledore if Draco cannot do it. Then, in the first chapter, the hook was that Harry suspected Draco was up to something. There are 2 problems here. Firstly, the reader would already know what Draco is up to, meaning the hook in the first chapter adds no tension to the story. Secondly, it makes the prologue pointless. If the reader was going to be left wondering what Draco and Snape are up to by the first chapter, then the prologue just slows down the reader getting to that point. When using this double hook structure, it's important to have each hook target 2 different questions in the narrative. Rowling understood this. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, the prologue leaves the reader wondering, what has Snape promised to do if Draco can't, while the first chapter has nothing to do with this. Instead, it starts off with Dumbledore offering to take Harry on a secret mission, leaving the reader wondering, what is Dumbledore planning? The 2 hooks eventually become somewhat connected, but this is not until far later in the book. Ensure your prologue targets a different question to that of the first chapter. It is also important to consider the type of hook as well. The advantage of a prologue is that it lets you write from a different character's point of view, at a different time, or in a different place. This means prologues are often used to depict pivotal scenes crucial to the development of the tension in the story that the characters in the main narrative could not possibly be aware of. For example, in A Game of Thrones by G.R. Martin, the prologue is written from the perspective of a Night's Watchman, and it depicts the mysterious others far north of the wall raising wildlings from the dead, playing Tetris with their bodies, and then killing the Watchman's comrades. This tells the reader there are fantastical elements coming and introduces a threat that one of the main characters, Jon Snow, will eventually face, but cannot possibly be aware of, as the supernatural threat does not appear until chapter 52, 500 pages into the story. At the beginning, the novel holds strictly to a core of medieval realism, and Jon is neither at the wall, nor does he know what's going on there. It would be incredibly difficult to introduce this supernatural threat in the main narrative without dropping awkward exposition along the lines of, "So, did you hear about how there's, like, ice zombies?" The prologue hook should be something that cannot be effectively communicated early in the main narrative, because the main characters cannot know about it, but is still crucial to the development of the tension in the narrative. Necessity. The prologue is the first experience the reader has of your story, meaning it is even more critical to consider why the segment is necessary to read as something, of course, you should ask for every part of your story. One great example of a necessary prologue is in John Green's Paper Towns, where we get a scene in the past of Quentin and Margot finding a dead body in the park. The scene is crucial because of this passage. "Lots of people get divorces and don't kill themselves," I said. "I know," she said, excitement in her voice. "That's what I told Juanita Alvarez." And then she said. Margot flipped the notebook page. She said that Mr. Joyner was troubled. And then I asked what that meant, and then she told me that we should just pray for him, and that I needed to take the sugar to my mom, and I said forget the sugar, and left. I said nothing again. I just wanted her to keep talking, that small voice tense with the excitement of almost knowing things, making me feel like something important was happening to me. "I think I maybe know why," she finally said. "Why?" "Maybe all the strings inside him broke," she said. The final line in this passage introduces the metaphor of the strings that Green references 15 times throughout the book. That is even the title of 1/3 of it. Without showing the reader where this metaphor comes from and Margot's way of thinking, the reader wouldn't be able to as accurately grasp the themes and how Quentin thinks about Margot, which is a massive part of the story. It is immediately relevant to the reader's understanding of the story from the first chapter forward, and laying it out in detail is far more visceral than if we were just told about it in an expository passage. But when is a prologue based around a character backstory necessary? It can be tempting to follow the logic that where a character has a traumatic past, the reader should know about it, and so you should put it in a prologue. But most of the time, backstory is better given as a flashback later in the story, because that event in their past does not help the reader understand the beginning of the novel. For example, consider which elements of character backstory we are given in the first episode of Altered Carbon. It depicts the main character, Tokishi Kovacs, in his old and original body, and it then shows how he was captured by the state forces, whom he seems to recognize. This use of character backstory creates an immediate juxtaposition with the next scene, or first chapter, where we see the same character wake up in his new body 200 years later. Seeing the same character in two bodies is jarring for both the viewer and character, and it really helps us to understand the fundamental premise of the story, that people can shift their consciousness into a new body. The prologue scene does not depict his involvement with the rebellion, his relationship with his sister, or his military training, because none of these parts of his backstory are relevant to understanding the first chapter. What makes a prologue necessary is that it introduces an element fundamental to understanding the novel from that point forward in a far more impactful way than exposition would. When it comes to a backstory prologue, it can be important to only introduce elements immediately relevant to understanding the first chapter. Things relevant far later in the story can be left for the main narrative. 2. Exposition. One of the major criticisms editors, agents, publishers, and readers have of prologues is that they're just exposition dumps, particularly in science fiction and fantasy, depicting how the magic sword was made, or how the Dark Lord was originally defeated, or how the space potatoes came to be. Essentially, some writers use the prologue to give an expository lore dump about their world's history, politics, laws, and magic system. While it may be fascinating to the author, most people do not enjoy such expository pieces, because they simply do not care about it, and will not remember it. While it is important for you to understand that exposition-based prologues are generally badly received, I am not going to just tell you to not have exposition in your prologue. Instead, we are going to talk about 2 ways to use exposition in your prologue: mystery and emotionalism. Mystery. In J.A. Rowling's Harry Potter and Philosopher's Stone, Chapter 1 is really more of a prologue. It is written from a different perspective to the main narrative, and is set a long time in the past. At the same time, it functionally communicates the following pieces of exposition. 1. Lily and James are dead, and their son survived. 2. The Dark Lord has been defeated, and the boy was somehow involved. 3. There is a world of wizards hiding from non-magical people, called muggles. 4. These wizards wear strange clothes, and have been fighting a war for years. Rowling communicates these things with an air of mystery. They are saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry. But he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why, or how, but they are saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. There are a lot of unknowns in the story. Strange things happen throughout the first chapter that communicate only parts of the full exposition. Collectively, they create this mysterious, half-finished puzzle for the reader where they are more focused on the questions they have than the exposition they have been given. Emotionalism. In G.R. Martin's A Dance with Dragons, the prologue features a wounded and broken character called Varamir, the skin changer like Bran. Martin spends most of the chapter developing Varamir as a character, giving us insight into his motivations, what he hates about his life, how he remembers dying 9 times, how he longs for the days of glory in his past, and how exhausted and drained he now feels. The reader is drawn into the experiences of Varamir. The focus of the story is on his personal journey as a character, right up to his eventual acceptance of death. Yet, simultaneously, Martin communicates a lot of exposition about how the powers of skin changers work. 1. It can drive them mad being stuck in an animal's body for too long. 2. Skin changers often lose their humanity after changing so often. 3. It is possible to become too weak to jump into another's mind. 4. Those strong enough can cast you out. Sure enough, these elements and others that become important in Bran's storyline later on. In the case of both Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone and A Dance with Dragons, the authors only communicate the vital pieces of exposition that frame the narrative. Rowling doesn't talk about the 1692 statute of wizarding secrecy, she talks about the one vital event that defines Harry's life, our main character. Martin doesn't talk about the relationship between the children of the forest and skin changers, he uses a whole story to communicate some vital things that explain problems Bran has to face later on. Unique tone, mood, or theme. A prologue can serve to establish a unique tone, mood, or theme that is not as easy to communicate in a first chapter. For example, James S. A. Corey uses his prologue in Leviathan Wakes to distinguish his science fiction novel as this mystery Lovecraftian horror story, something uncommon in mainstream science fiction. A torture chamber, then. Tubes ran through the ship like veins or airways. Part of it pulsed. Flesh. An outcropping of the thing shifted toward her. Captain Darren's head. Help me, it said. That last line from Captain Darren is the only piece of dialogue in the prologue at all, reinforcing this creepy, gloomy silence the reader experiences throughout, putting them in the shoes of the perspective character shifting about the ship. The prologue is heavy on descriptive language, and it lingers on those things we find most unsettling, like this revolting flesh abomination. Such a Lovecraftian horror mood would not be easy to communicate in the first chapter, as it features a lighter tone with friendly characters bantering. Focus on language and description that highlights that unique feature of your story, metaphors critical to development of a theme, dialogue supporting the tone, or descriptive pieces establishing mood. Length. In terms of how long a prologue should be, most agents and editors advise it to be short. For example, the Avatar, The Last Airbender prologue is only 1 minute and 17 seconds long, when the average chapter is about 22 minutes. An Exercise in Bad Prologues, Eragon by Christopher Paolini. While many of us may have loved this unabashed, unashamedly fantastical tale of dragon riders and enchanting elves, as I surely did, we must not be afraid to consider it critically. The prologue is called A Shade of Fear, and it depicts Arya, an elf, being cornered by the evil shade, Durza. Unable to escape, Arya sends the egg westward, where Eragon would find it in the first chapter. 1. Does the book have 2 distinct hooks? A close examination reveals that it does not. The prologue hook leaves us with the question, what is this magical sapphire stone? The question arising in the first chapter is then, what is this magical sapphire stone? Given the cover of the novel features of a blue dragon, neither of these are much of a mystery. 2. Is it necessary? The prologue tells us Durza and Arya are out there, but not much more. If anything, it somewhat demystifies the dreams Eragon has later in the book. He dreams of Arya, but he does not know who she is. The reader, however, is not the least bit surprised that the mysterious dark-haired elf girl he dreams of is the mysterious dark-haired elf girl in the prologue. 3. How does it deliver its exposition? To give Paolini a point here, his prologue is not an exposition dump, but it does not communicate much more than who Derza is, and Derza is not that interesting. 4. Does it communicate a unique tone, mood, or theme? This is partly why the prologue in Eragon is criticized so heavily. It may communicate the traditional, Tolkien-esque feel to the story, but this doesn't communicate anything the reader is not expecting. Given the genre-defining role that stories like The Lord of the Rings played in fantasy, readers still have an assumption that fantasy stories will be like this unless told otherwise. Summary. 1. Firstly, have hooks that target two different points of tension in the narrative in the prologue and first chapter. If used, that hook should be something unable to be effectively communicated through the experiences of the main characters, but fundamental to the reader's expectations and experience of the story going forward. 2. Secondly, a prologue must be necessary. Backstory prologues are generally better if they only provide backstory insofar as it helps the reader understand the very first chapter. 3. Thirdly, avoid prologues that are exposition dumps. Weave exposition in through emotionalism and mystery. 4. Fourthly, prologues can be used to communicate a unique tone, mood, or theme that cannot be effectively established in the first chapter. 5. Ultimately, do not include a prologue unless it is necessary, and you can do it well. However, at the same time, write the story you want to tell. This is our only responsibility as writers. Part 2. The first chapter. Mortal Engines by Philip Reeve, King Lear by William Shakespeare, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, Percy Jackson by Rick Riordan, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.A. Rowling, Avatar, The Last Airbender by Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, Doctor Who, Doomsday by Russell T. Davies, Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer, The Gunslinger by Stephen King, Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. You've decided whether you want to use a prologue, and if you do, how you want to write it. Now for the first chapter, which is, in truth, even more important given that a large proportion of readers skip over prologues anyway. Opening chapters are kind of like an exam for a writer. They are insanely difficult to write, but vital to your work, and they are really where people see if this is the kind of book they want to read. You get to introduce your main characters and convince your audience that you have something to say, and that it will be interesting. But how do you write them? If you are smashing your head on your desk in response to that question, that's okay, you are in excellent company. Yelling into a pillow that you don't know how to write is more of a prerequisite to being a writer than anything else. We will be breaking this down into 4 parts: the mini 3-act structure, opening lines, tone, and the hook. The mini 3-act structure. The best way to start your book will vary depending on your genre, style, and legitimate personal creative choices, but there are certain setups that will be better received by the average reader than others. Most writers are somewhat familiar with the 3-act structure, which comes in all shapes and formulas depending on who you ask, but a very simple version of it can be useful in structuring your opening chapter. 1. The introduction of a problem. 2. The exploration of that problem. 3. The resolution of the problem. For example, in Philip Reeve's Mortal Engines, the first chapter has a problem introduced. The protagonist Tom isn't allowed to see the city of London chase the town of Solhook. The problem is explored. Tom argues with his mentor and thinks about why he wants to see it so much. The problem is then resolved. Tom sneaks away to see the spectacle. For a more active example, consider Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. First, the problem is introduced. Percy's teacher is actually a monster trying to kill him. The problem is explored. He fights the monster. The problem is resolved. Percy kills the monster by accident. The reason the mini 3-act structure works so well is because it does more than create an interesting conflict for the writer to explore in their first chapter. It allows you to show what kind of conflict the reader can expect in the story. It allows you to show how the main character thinks and deals with conflict, making them seem proactive, rather than passive, from the beginning. It is important to note that these problems can be internal or external. When choosing the problem your character faces in the first chapter, you should use it to reflect the struggles in the wider story. In Mortal Engines, the London Salthook chase immediately establishes that a lack of resources is a massive source of conflict, resulting in cities attacking one another for them. This, in turn, establishes the post-apocalyptic setting and assists in world building. Likewise, Riordan's opening problem immediately establishes that the reader can expect Percy to be fighting monsters from Greek mythology. This in turn establishes the genre of the fantastical adventure. If the conflict in the story will be character-driven, then perhaps the opening conflict will involve a lot of internal reflection, as a physical confrontation, or the like might mislead the reader as to the feel of your story. Crucially, the mini 3-act structure also allows you to introduce how Characters approach problems, whether they are full of self-doubt or overconfidence, whether they are physically adept or disabled, and whether they are honest or they trick their opponents. This can help introduce aspects of your character, especially if they have quirks or a unique perspective on the world that can make them interesting and distinguish them from your average hero or heroine. In Percy Jackson, we learn that Percy relies on instinct but is full of self-doubt. In Owen Colfer's Artemis Fowl, we learn when Artemis tricks a fairy in the opening scene that he manipulates his enemies, is relatively utilitarian and unempathetic, and holds a genius-level intellect. Fundamentally, the mini-3-act structure allows the author to go through the who, what, when, where, why, and how without it feeling like a laundry list of exposition. Alternatively, many authors use the opening chapter problem as the inciting incident, the thing that really launches your main character into the story, and that is perfectly fine. However, if you choose to do this, the resolution part of the 3-act structure doesn't need to mean the protagonist solves the problem. It could end in disaster, like in The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, or it could simply be that the main character resolves to fix this problem, and so begins their quest. It is a curious thing to note that the opening chapter problem is also sometimes used as a form of foreshadowing called a pre-scene, which is where an earlier plot event mimics a much larger version of that event that will appear later on. We will discuss foreshadowing and the pre-scene technique in more detail in Part 4. Opening lines. There are very few things more difficult to write than opening chapters in a book, but one of them is definitely opening lines. These lines can emphasize setting, tone, character, voice, mood, the conflict, tension, drama, genre, theme, mystery, or the fact that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. The line you choose will be dependent on the kind of story you want to write. To begin with, let's start with one of the best, in my opinion, opening lines of any novel, George Orwell's 1984. It was a bright cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. With this line, the reader becomes curious, because none of this makes sense. April was springtime for his British audience, suggesting hope and life, but it is described as cold, suggesting either winter or a darker mood. The fact that the clocks are striking 13 immediately tells the reader that something has gone wrong in this place, this dystopian society. After all, clocks do not strike 13. Beyond this, 13 is known as an unlucky number, a foreboding sign. Orwell uses juxtaposition of weather and season, fact and fiction to introduce the theme that just as the characters should, the reader should question everything in this world he has built. To take a more contemporary example, let us consider Philip Reeve's Mortal Engines. It was a dark, blustery afternoon in spring, and the city of London was chasing a small mining town across the dried-out bed of the Old North Sea. Reeve uses his opening line to establish setting, primarily. From the beginning, the withered, lifeless world of his dystopian future is established with the mention of a dried-out seabed.